First of all, let me just say what a joy it is to be with you this morning here at Grace Baptist Church. When two people have known one another as long as your pastor and I have, it's probably a wise thing not to ask the one to get to talking about the other. You just never know what stories might be told. I'd forgotten how anxious your pastor can be, how nervous he can be. And I guess he has some reason for that. A number of years ago, he had asked me to come over and preach, and you guys were on the old campus before moving in here. And I had failed to put that request on my calendar, and so Sunday morning, about the time for it might have even been a few minutes into the morning worship service, I get this call from Bill Haynes and wondering where I am. I said, well, I'm here in Louisville. I'm worshiping with my home church, and that's not where I was supposed to be. Well, this morning, I was kind of hanging around out here in the foyer, and I headed out to my car for just a moment. Your pastor saw me headed that way and screamed at me, and I could tell the anxiety was setting in. Where are you going? Where are you going? And I'm quite certain he was thinking, okay, finally got him here. Can we keep him here, at least for this morning? Well, I want to tell you it is good to be here with you this morning. Thank you so much. Missions, wow. The mission-minded church, the mission-minded home. We're going to take a look at a passage in Mark chapter 1 this morning. So please go ahead and turn your Bibles there. Let me just set the stage for this text that we will read, verses 16 through 20. It is his calling of his first disciples. Now, Jesus has already been introduced by Mark as the Son of God. He is very God of very God. He can do anything. After all, he is God. Yet, what we discover is that in his ministry in Galilee, in Judea, in Jerusalem, he uses means. He uses others to come alongside him. To put it, if we could put it this way, and this sounds odd to our ears, doesn't it? This one who is God, he asks for help. That just sounds odd. Something just a bit odd about that statement. And yet, it is exactly what he does. And what an honor for these disciples. What an honor for us that he uses us in the preaching of his gospel. And not only to those who are near, but to those who are far, even to the ends of the earth. You know, it might be analogous to something like this. Imagine your favorite ball coach, whether it be basketball or football or whatever that might be. And I don't know what color he might wear, whether it be blue or red or garnet and gold. But your favorite coach one day contacts you and invites you there to courtside or to the sideline on the football field. He says, look, I want you, just you. I want you to come and stand beside me. I want you to learn from me. In fact, I'm even going to let you do some coaching. I'm going to let you give some direction. I'm going to put you into games, so to speak. Wow, what an honor to come from one of those beloved coaches, one of those well-known coaches. We have a much greater honor than that. These disciples had a much greater honor than that, to be asked by Jesus. In fact, we might even say to be instructed by Jesus, to come and follow him, to learn from him, to work with him, alongside with him. In verse 38 of this first chapter, we begin to learn something about the ministry that Jesus is embarking upon. The disciples have said, look, Master, everybody's looking for you. And Jesus says, let us go on to the next towns that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out. I'm going into the towns, and you're going with me. We're going to preach the gospel, the good news. The message that there is this holy God who has made us all, that we have all sinned against Him and now stand under His wrath and in His judgment. And yet there is this one, this Son of God, who has come and taken the sins of His people upon Himself and paid the penalty due them, so that those who repent and believe in Him, follow after Him, their sins are forgiven. They are now called sons and daughters of the Most High God and have the assurance of an eternal inheritance in heaven. He said, come on, I'm going to preach. This is for this that I have come. Come along with me. Now, commentators are pretty well agreed that this is not the first time these men would have heard about Jesus when He calls them into the ministry. In fact, if you were to look over in John's Gospel in chapter 1, verse 35, and just read a number of verses there, you will discover that the disciples of the Baptist, that is John the Baptist, while he was still alive, among them were Peter and Andrew, but there were certainly some of John's disciples who were there and had heard him and had spent time with him. This is not the first occasion for them to see Jesus, to hear Jesus, but it's a special occasion, isn't it? Something changes here for them. Something new takes place. Let's read about it. Mark chapter 1, beginning in verse 16. Passing alongside the Sea of Galilee, He saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men. And immediately they left their nets and followed Him. And going on a little farther, He saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were in their boat mending their nets. And immediately He called them. And they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and followed Him. I would like to make a number of statements, several observations concerning this text, this episode in the life and the ministry of Jesus and His disciples. These are very obvious observations to make from the text, but I suspect those are pretty much the best ones. Let the text speak to us just directly and clearly. And the first observation that I would make is simply this. These men, they were fishermen. Wow, Brother George, that's pretty obvious. Well, yeah. These men were fishermen. They were all fishermen. And when we think about it, isn't this the way that God so often operates? He chooses not many wise. He chooses not many who are powerful, not many who are high-born, but rather, isn't it the case that He so often chooses the weak, those whom the world considers foolish, in order to demonstrate the foolishness of the world's wisdom? That's exactly what Paul writes about in the Corinthian correspondence, isn't it? God chooses the weak so often. So often, those who are considered the fools by the world, those who are of little reputation, just everyday folks. These guys, they're fishermen. That's all they are. They fish. We can say something else about them. They were not idlers. They were not lazy. They were fishermen. They had to work hard for their living in order to live, to provide a living for their families. They were not idlers. The old preacher John Trapp made this observation that God calls men when they are busy, Satan when they are idle. Isn't that so true? These men were not idle. They were not sitting around taking it easy. Rather, they were busy at their life's work, preparing to catch fish, going out and actually catching fish. Think about it for a moment. Think about the characteristics, the attributes, the descriptions of these men, these fishermen. They were not the wise and the learned, with all the degrees behind their names. Otherwise, one has noted that they would have turned that which was simple, the gospel, into endless commentaries and endless disputes and intellectual puzzles that people would struggle to understand. But no, these are men who will present the message, even as Jesus did, so powerfully and so profoundly and yet so simply and so clearly that even the shepherds on the hill had to take notice. These were fishermen, busy, hardworking, not the wise and the learned. But it's a good thing that they weren't, perhaps. We can also say about these men, they were not the rich. Otherwise, it is likely that they would have weighed the good news of the gospel, the good news of this message, down with the cares of worldly wealth. Have you ever noticed how those who have so much of this world's goods seem so very little interested in the gospel? You know, I pastored for a number of years in Louisville in a very difficult area before the Lord called my family and myself to Indonesia. And I remember that, it was an area of broken families, just some, I want to be gracious here, but I'm going to tell you, just some people in that area, in those neighborhoods, just made a lot of bad life choices. Do you get where I'm coming from? Broken families, destroyed lives. We had this idea that as a church, we had kind of this Acts 1:8 mentality approach to ministry. You'll preach the gospel beginning in Jerusalem, then Judea and Samaria, and ultimately to the ends of the earth. And so we had kind of mapped out what we considered our geographical Jerusalem. And we tried every year to knock on every single door within those several blocks around the church campus. We didn't see many conversions from that work. But one thing we did discover is that people often were willing to talk. In fact, people were often willing to invite us into their homes and to listen. These days, I live out in the Middletown area of Jefferson County, east of downtown Louisville, in a much more affluent area. Our church out there once tried this. We'd kind of mapped out several neighborhoods, trying to go door to door, much more affluent area. Tried to knock on doors and talk with people. We could not get people to give us the time of day. What was the difference? What do you think was the difference between these two locations, these two populations? Perhaps I can illustrate that. A number of years ago, I was teaching in our extension center up in New York City, there in mid-Manhattan, just off of Central Park. And there was a young man there, his name was Paul. The Lord had saved him, had brought him out of Judaism and out of an Orthodox Jewish family to the gospel. His family had disowned him, completely washed their hands of him, broke his heart. He worked in the music business. He was a booking agent of sorts for these big-name jazz acts. In those days, people like George Benson and Ella Fitzgerald and some of the really big-name jazz acts. And Paul would talk with me about trying to share the gospel with those folks, and they would not listen. He would just cry, brokenhearted. But one day he told me, he said, Dr. Martin, I have a sermon title for you. He said, now you're going to have to write the sermon. But I'll give you the title. Here's the title. I don't need Jesus. I've got a Mercedes. Does it make sense to you? I tell you, we can weigh the good news of the gospel down with all worldly cares and worldly wealth. Isn't it a good thing that these disciples were not so caught up in in the things of this world, the wealth of this world, the desires of this world. Jesus did not choose the wise and learned. He did not choose the rich. He did not choose the religious leaders who would have likely dissolved His charity and His mercy, His love, in the acids of all of their theological hatreds and divisions. He didn't choose politicians. He had no interest in the sneaking, if I could say this. Pastor, I suspect we have some wealthy people in this church. I suspect we have some wise and learned people in this church. I know we have some religious leaders. I'm looking at one. I suspect that we have some politicians in this congregation. I don't know. I've probably stomped on a lot of toes this morning. But let me suggest to you that He did not call politicians. He had no interest in the sneaky, self-serving connivings of such people that we often see. I'm going to tell you who He called to His side, to preach the gospel with Him, to go from town to town, from village to village. He called fishermen. Isn't that amazing? This one who is God, He could have gathered any to His side, and He gathered fishermen. There's a second observation that I would make here. Simply this: Jesus met them where they were. Jesus met them where they were. Likely they were surprised. I think there's a lesson here for us. This story teaches us that we must always be ready to make a quick and even abrupt turn in obedience to God. There's no telling when or where He might meet us and say, go here or go there, do this or do that. Always ready with an obedient answer, yes, Lord. With the prophet Isaiah, here am I, Lord, send me. Whether as individuals or families or as congregations. Jesus met them where they were, there in their everyday lives as fishermen. He even used language to fit the context, didn't He? Come with me. I'll make you become fishers of men. I tell you, these men cannot stay where they are, either geographically or otherwise. They simply cannot. They will now leave their homes. They will leave their professions, their relationships, all that they have known, and they will travel with Jesus and serve alongside Him. They themselves will be changed. William Hendrickson, in his marvelous commentary on Mark, he put it this way: Simon the fickle must become Peter the rock, and something similar for each of the others, and so for us. Isn't it so often the case that if we follow Jesus, truly follow Jesus, certainly we must be willing, even if it doesn't happen, but certainly we must be willing to go where He says to go, to do what He says to do, to associate with those whom He tells us we must associate, and in His timing. They cannot stay where they were, geographically or in any other way. Consider with me for a moment some additional characteristics of these men. They were not wise, they were not learned. We've been through all of that. Consider this: they were men who lacked spiritual understanding. In fact, right here in this same gospel, in Mark chapter 4, verse 13, after Jesus had told a parable, apparently he seems to think that they should have gotten the point of the parable. They should have understood it. So obvious. But He has to ask them in that verse, do you not understand this parable? What, you don't get this? These were men who were slow to learn. They were not spiritual giants. They lacked spiritual understanding. And yet one day, they will teach and preach to kings and priests. They are unfeeling. They often were calloused and indifferent to others. You remember there in Mark chapter 10 how the children began to come to Jesus. They were brought to Jesus. The disciples turned them away. The disciples refused the children, and yet one day, these very same men will weep over the people. They were prideful. Oh, prideful. Always seemingly jockeying for position amongst themselves. You remember again in this same gospel, Mark chapter 9, how they discussed amongst themselves who was the greatest and who would be the greatest. And yet one day, they will boast in nothing but Jesus Christ crucified. They were cowards. Cowards. Remember how in Mark chapter 14 we read that they left Jesus and they fled? You remember in that same chapter Peter's denial? They were cowards. And yet one day, they will choose to be martyred rather than to deny their Lord. Jesus met them where they were, and they must change. They must change geographical locations. They must change relationships. They themselves will be changed. And so it is with us. We cannot be what we once were. In fact, that's one of the true tests of a genuine believer, isn't it? That person is not what he or she once was, not yet what he or she one day will be, but guaranteed not what they once were. What's the old adage? If it looks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. If it looks like a worldling, if it talks like a worldling, if it lives like a worldling, it's probably worldling. On the other hand, if that person looks like a disciple of Christ, if that person talks like a disciple of Christ, if that person lives like a disciple of Christ, there's a disciple of Christ. I tell you, these men would be changed. They could not remain where they were or what they were. Jesus met them where they were and took them elsewhere. There's a third observation I would like to make. They were fishermen. That's all they were, just fishermen. Jesus met them where they were to take them elsewhere. Thirdly, Jesus spoke to them with authority. Jesus spoke to them, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. Don't you get the sense that Jesus spoke with great authority here? In fact, we sung about that a few moments ago, it seems to me. There are not many of us here. I certainly am not counted as one, but perhaps there are some here in the congregation who remember that World War II poster. I've seen pictures of it. Many of us have. Uncle Sam is standing there very sternly with his finger pointed out, and he says what? To the young men of this nation, "I want you for military service, to go to battle in Europe and in the Pacific. I want you." In those days, the U.S. military was not full voluntary as it is today. The United States government get whoever they wanted. It's called the draft. I have stories about the draft, but you don't want to hear them right now. The government get whoever they wanted. You remember, I don't know if any of you watch musicals. I'm not big on musicals, musical theater, musical movies, where they sing all the time. If it's recorded, I kind of pass over. I'm watching it with my wife, Dawn. I try to pass over the singing. But there is that one musical, Oklahoma. Some of you have seen that. So actually, it's a wonderful musical. You remember on that one occasion, the woman sings, "I'm going to get my man." You remember that line from, no. Well, she sings, "I'm going to get my man." And guess what? She gets her man. Some of you guys in here know about this. Yeah, some of you know. Yeah. She got her man. And some have had her man, 60 years, 67? 66. Wow. Those were amazing stories this morning. Yeah, God always gets his man. God always gets his preacher. God always gets his missionary. Abram, wow, he was so doubtful, and you just wonder sometimes reading those early stories if Abraham would ever get with the program, but he did. Moses, all the excuses he offered up there in Exodus chapter 3. But God wanted him to go back to Egypt to deliver his people. What did Moses end up doing? You can answer that. Went back to Egypt to lead his people out. That's what God intended for him to do. Elijah, there at the brook, he didn't want to go speak to the king and his wife. He was scared of them. But God wanted him to go and to stand before royalty and call them to account. What did Elijah end up doing? The very thing that God intended for him to do. I can't help but think about Jeremiah. Oh, but Lord, I'm such a young man. Who am I? And all the excuses that he gave. God said, no, you will preach for 40 years. And you're going to preach a hard message. Oh, but Lord, I am only a young lad. What did Jeremiah end up doing? Preaching for 40 years. Jesus says to these disciples, come on, I will make you fishers of men. He spoke to them with authority, and they got up immediately and did his bidding. Which brings me to my fourth and final observation. All of them obeyed. Jesus, he spoke with authority, you know. You know how it is with your children, sometimes you simply call them by name. So sometimes I would simply, my son, Paul. But sometimes it would be Paul Austin Martin. And he understood exactly what that meant. Speaking with a little bit more authority here. Jesus spoke with authority on this occasion. What were the disciples to do? What were these fishermen to do? But to get up and to go and to do his bidding. Twice, in verse 18, Simon and Andrew. And then in verse 20, James and John, we see the suddenness, the quickness, the immediacy with which these fishermen obeyed Jesus Christ. Immediately they got up, even leaving their father, just left him there in the boat. Now we do know that they had heard about Jesus. They had had some associations with Jesus. But I'll tell you, this was different. Now, when the call came, they immediately obeyed, didn't they? They simply got up and went. Charles Spurgeon once noted that conversion is most fully displayed when it leads converts to seek the conversion of others. May I read that again? Conversion is most fully displayed when it leads converts to seek the conversion of others. He adds, we most truly follow Christ when we become fishers of men. You have several days in which you are thinking about, praying about, talking about missions. The missions-minded church, the missions-minded home. What is this all about? Fishing for men and for women and boys and girls. Can I try to bring all this to some conclusion and make some sort of application for us today? I think I would make application something along these lines. Number one, I would say to every one of us in this room, including myself, but since I'm looking at you, I'm going to use the second person. And I would say to you as a congregation, Grace Baptist Church, I would say to you as individuals, as families, God can use you. He used these fishermen. God can use you. You must not think too little of yourself. Oh, you must be humble. You must understand who you are as sinners saved by grace. On the other hand, you must not think too little of yourself. I've heard it. Boy, I've heard the conversations. I've been involved in them. Well, I've never done that. Well, I don't think I could do that. We do not have the resources for this or for that, or we don't have the talent, we don't have the giftings for this or for that. I heard an old preacher once put it this way: the measure of a church's health is not how many it brings in, but how many it sends out. A number of years ago, Dr. Jerry Rankin, president then of the International Mission Board, I heard him tell the story of being invited by a young couple who had been appointed as new international missionaries by our Southern Baptist International Mission Board. And there was the big formal appointment service that the IMB does with those new missionaries. But their home church also wanted to do a much more personal, congregational family sort of affirmation and laying on of hands and sending them out. And this young couple had a relationship with Jerry Rankin and just asked him if he would come and preach that service, and he did. Later he told the story, and I heard him tell the story about being there in that congregation. He said they were so proud, so excited, as they should have been. And I can affirm him in that. Oh, absolutely. Church was over 200 years old. First missionaries sent out to the world. Oh, it was a day of excitement and joy and pride. Jerry Rankin's response, as he told the story, I don't think he said this to the congregation, but his question was, why did it take you so long? Why did it take 200 plus years? Grace Baptist Church. There's a missions heart here. There's a missions mindedness here. But I would say to you, you can and you must dream even bigger than you have. Dream big dreams for the gospel. Dream big dreams for your neighborhoods and your city. Dream big dreams for the world. Your God is great. And He is able to do things in you and through you far beyond anything that you could ever imagine. Folks, these were fishermen. And Christ used them to turn the world upside down. God can use you. A second observation and application: you must, as a congregation, never fall prey to merely maintenance thinking. It is given to you not merely to be ministered to, but to minister to. Not to be ministered to, but to minister to. Now, someone will say, but wait a minute, Brother George. The Word, the Bible itself, has much to say to us about such a ministry to the church and in the church. Congregational care, pastoral care, and all of that. The building up of the church. The church itself is to be edified, is to be fed, is to be protected. Absolutely. Absolutely. But in an Ephesians 4 frame of mind, these ministries are done for the very purpose of what? With the very goal that you will be equipped to do the work of the ministry of the gospel, which God has given to you. I sought to choose my words carefully here. You must not fall prey to merely maintenance thinking. You must look inward and look after one another. But if that's all that we do, we have failed to possess the mind and the heart of our God for His world. The third observation: some will say, I cannot. We cannot. But Jesus says, I can through you. Agus. lives in a Muslim context, strong Muslim context, up in the mountains on the other side of the world. It's not his real name. I've changed his name, but we'll call him Agus. He's a farmer. A number of years ago, he leased, as so many in his area, leased plots of land from the wealthy landowners in an adjacent big city who owned so much property out there in that area. And one day, Agus heard the gospel and believed and became a Christian. Well, his neighbors heard of it, saw the change in him, and were very upset. Some of the village leaders went to the big landowners and said to them, encouraged them, pleaded with them to punish Agus and to withhold the possibility of leasing land for the upcoming growing season. And so that was done. All the other farmers got together, and as was their habit, they would get together for the upcoming growing season, and they'd look at the rainfall and the growing conditions, and the soil condition, and try to make a communal decision on what will be the best crop for us this year. And that particular year, they had decided onions. And so they all bought onion sets, and they planted their plots, and the onions were growing. In the meantime, Agus had nowhere to plant. His family began to suffer. He was suffering. Some of the villagers began to take some degree of pity on him and went back to the big landowners and said, maybe you ought to give him a little bit of land to farm. They gave him a poor piece of property. Well, all the really good onion sets were already taken. There were few left over. He took those and he planted them and did what he could right in the middle of the growing season. Well, the end of the season came. It was harvest time. And the vegetable buyers from the big cities, they came in. True story. Came in and the farmers set up their booths along the main street there in the town and had their produce on display, and the buyers would come along and look at the different produce and make their decisions and purchase them and pay the highest price for the best. And so you know how this goes. Some of you are farmers. This particular year, guess who had the best onions and received the highest price for his produce? It was Agus. People didn't understand. He simply gave testimony of his God who was faithful. He continued to live and to share the good news. And today, in those mountains, are small Baptist churches here and there because of Agus. More accurately, because God saved Agus and worked amazingly through his life and his ministry. Folks, these were nothing but fishermen. God used them to turn the world upside down. Agus was nothing but an onion farmer. And today there are multiple churches because of his coming to the gospel and his faithfulness. I tell you, our God can do far beyond anything that we might ever dream of or imagine. But we are called to such things. The responsibility to take the gospel to those who are near, but also to those who are far. Father, we thank you for your word as we have considered the story of the calling of the first disciples. Father, it seems as they were such insignificant men. Little education, many of them. Little reputation. And yet what you did through them and in them. Father, I pray for this congregation, for Grace Baptist Church. And Father, I ask that you would let this congregation never dream small dreams, but dream big dreams for the sake of the gospel. To look out upon the world with the same sense of urgency, the same passion that you have, to take the gospel to those who do not have it. Father, raise up here in this place those who would pray unceasingly, those who would give sacrificially, and even those who would get up and themselves go. And Father, even as we have rehearsed these things this morning, we began by remembering the work of Jesus to go into the villages to preach the gospel. And we rehearsed that gospel briefly. Father, if there are those here this morning who have never come to that gospel savingly, believingly, turning from their sins, Father, today draw them to the Savior. And perhaps even those would be the ones, perhaps, you would raise up and send out. Father, have your way with us. Have your way with Grace Baptist Church. And use this dear congregation to take your gospel, those who desperately need it. I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.